welcome to another episode of the Chicana Therapist podcast. It has officially been about a month since I started this podcast, and I am so grateful to everyone who's taken the time to listen, to support, to share. I am always in awe of how community shows up for you, and I'm just very grateful. And I'm also having a lot of fun. I actually enjoy this process. I am always open to feedback. Whatever feedback you have for me, I'm open to it, especially when it comes to topics, because as a mental health nerd, sometimes I think people will really like something and it might not be the case, or it's too niche or something. But if you have a suggestion, please feel free to message me, email me, comment on the clips that I post online, and I would be happy to touch on it. So today I want to talk about being bicultural and how that can impact our mental health, our wellness, our sense of belonging, well, how it can affect everything. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about because we talk a lot about pride, right? Cultural pride. We talk about being proud to be Latina, being proud to be Mexican, Chicana, what have you, but we rarely talk about how it can also be difficult for some of us. And I'll talk more about that. But I also think that it's very important to nurture our biculturalism, and I'll talk more about that. But when I was dissertating, and as I was talking to my study participants, one of the things I was interested in learning was how being bicultural impacted their mental health, how it impacted any conflict that they had with their caregivers as they were growing up. And it turns out from my study, and also honestly from personal experience, that it can really affect us when we don't feel like we belong either in one culture, in the other, or more commonly, when we feel we don't belong in either. And so ever since then, I've made it a point to talk to parents about their kids being bicultural and about raising bicultural kids and the importance of nurturing that as opposed to shaming or policing. We're going to get more into that. But that is kind of where this topic is coming from. Something that I think we need to talk more about, especially as parents, but also just for ourselves, right? I think there's a lot of talk around, terms like no sabo kids and things like that. And there are real impacts to referring to people that way. But anyway, if this is something that interests you, then this episode is for you. So let's start with defining biculturalism. I know that sounds silly, but we have to. Being bicultural means that you are a part of two cultures, two worlds. Being bicultural does not necessarily mean that we're at a 50-50 split in cultures. It's a constant negotiation. It can get really complicated. There's a saying that I think originated with La India Maria, maybe. This concept of ni de aquí ni de allá, which translates into not from here nor from there. And some people have even taken it back and say de aquí y de allá, from here and from there. And it's so real, this idea of we belong to two different cultures, but sometimes we're rejected by one of them or both of them. But to be honest, it can be really exhausting. It can be exhausting to move between worlds. I hear a lot of young people say, I'm at school, and while I can be a bit myself around my friends and things, I do feel like I'm exposed to a certain culture, more American culture. And then I come home and it's a whole other culture there, right? For me personally, I go out into the world as a Chicana, yes, and I go from space to space, code switching, whether it's a professional switch or whatever the case may be. And then I come home and, well, as an adult, it feels very much me and like the real me. because I am both. I'm American and I'm Mexican, but some youth have expressed that they go to school and they feel very American, and then they come home and they feel very Latino, very Mexican, very Puerto Rican, whatever the case may be. And so the constant switching back and forth, constantly being aware of how you present depending on the space that you're in. And some of us could say, I go out in the world and I'm surrounded by a culture, and then I come home and at home feels like me, feels like my culture. But I have heard youth say the other way around. Like, I go to school and I feel like I can be myself, and I come home and I feel left out, or I feel like I don't belong. And this could be for a variety of reasons, but I do hear this a lot from the youth, and I heard it a lot from the participants in my study. And then there's the fact that biculturalism can show up differently depending on what generation you're in. Are you first gen? Are you 1.5 gen? To me, 1.5 gen is like my kids. I am born here, but their father wasn't. Or are you second, third, fourth generation Latina? That can look very different as well. And then that adds another layer of complication to how we show up in a space. Because how I show up as a first gen Latina, as a first gen Chicana, could be very different than a friend who's third, fourth generation Latina Mexicana. In addition to that, there's this piece of feeling invisible for certain things. For example, here in Colorado, there are a lot of Latinos who have been here for generations, who were here before it was the US, it was Mexico. And so, they feel like they're coming from a different perspective themselves. Or I've heard people say, I feel like I look Latina, but I feel like a fraud because I don't speak Spanish, or I speak it with, mucho, or I feel like I'm criticized for being too assimilated. So again, it can be really complicated and it can have a lot of layers. So I want to reiterate that being bicultural, I think, is a gift. It's actually pretty badass to be bicultural, in my opinion. But I want to acknowledge that there can be some psychological stress when it's unacknowledged, or when the person doesn't feel supported, or when you feel like your culture is being policed. And I want to talk more about that because that is something that also came up in my dissertation about youth feeling like their parents or their family tried to police how acculturated they became. And that was a real source of psychological stress. So it's okay to love your cultures and then have some critiques about it and feel like some people have made you feel not enough or like you don't belong. That doesn't mean you're betraying your culture. It is a valid experience, and I think that there should be more conversations around that. So as I shared before, I am the daughter of Mexican immigrants, and my experience was a little different, I think, than some other daughters of immigrants or kids of immigrants, because my parents came here fairly young and were able to learn English and were exposed to the US a lot by crossing the border before they moved here. And so my experience was a little different, but I work with a lot of people who had or have immigrant parents that don't speak English. They only speak Spanish or their indigenous language. And so the child grows up in a place of, I'm being raised in one culture, but I'm actually bicultural, because when I leave the house, I'm definitely surrounded by American culture. So the youth is being raised by two worlds simultaneously, even if the parents don't want to acknowledge it. Because I know a lot of parents who refuse to acknowledge that their child is being raised bicultural because they are so afraid that their child will lose the connection to their culture. Sometimes parents think that being Americanized, right? This is a word that I hear a lot, like they're Americanized. Sometimes the behaviors that go with that are seen as disrespectful, or seen like you reject family, or seen as like we're losing them to the Americans, right? But it doesn't have to be that way. Some examples of this are the importance, for example, in American culture, non-family is considered important. I'm not saying that in Latin American countries it's not, but definitely your world revolves around family, and friends always come second. Well, unless they eventually join the family, right? Sometimes we see a lot of family friends as family. But here, it's common for you to prioritize friends, for you to choose a family, for you to make time for friends, even when that means giving up family time. That's an example of some more American culture, whatever that means, right? But of a more American culture that immigrant parents have an issue with. And so this can cause a lot of conflict. They don't want to let you go with your friend because why do you need a friend? You have your cousins, you have your sisters, etc., etc. Sometimes youth also experience that their parents as immigrants have expectations that are suffocating or impossible. They don't feel seen for themselves because we come from a collectivist culture where the good of the group comes before the good of any individual. And an American view is more individualistic. And there are critiques, of course. I'm not saying we have to be individualistic, but sometimes youth want to be independent and focus on themselves, and the family can be really resistant to that. An example of that is when maybe your parents want you to pursue a certain career because that's what they've always thought you should do. That's going to be what's financially better. And the youth has maybe a dream that they want to pursue, something that their parents considers silly, and I see a lot of clash there. And then there are more specific barriers, like the language piece is big. As much as we want to teach our children Spanish, sometimes we grow up in homes. For example, I grew up in a home where we were required to speak Spanish at home. We were not, even though my parents understand English, I remember if I said something to my parents in English, they would say, nope, try again, or something like that, and I would have to say it in Spanish. I don't see that as much anymore. I remember that being a thing when I was a kid, but now what I see is that even when they try to teach their kids Spanish, they aren't getting exposure to formal education in Spanish or taught how to read in Spanish. So they only interact with family in Spanish, and so sometimes they get made fun of because they don't know how to say something in Spanish, or they say it wrong, or they pronounce it funny. And then we've got people in the family making fun of you for speaking like that when it's really not your fault. It's not your fault, right? My entire education, my formal education, was in English. I still struggle to express myself in Spanish in professional settings. Hell, even in social settings, let's be real. But there's that added pressure to be the cultural bridge for the family. So you're expected to translate sometimes, to interpret. You're expected to know things that you never were taught. You're expected to use your education to help family as much as you can, even when it's at your detriment. So all of this to say that it can get really complicated enough to impact a person's well-being, to impact their mental health. Because one thing we know about being well mentally is that we all need to have a sense of belonging. And when we don't get that, then that's when some danger can come in mentally. We see youth that are experiencing depression, even suicidal ideation. In the case of my study, that was part of it, right? Because a big precursor to suicide attempts is feeling like you don't belong or feeling like you're a burden. These are just a couple things. I won't go too much into suicide theory, but all of that to say that it really matters that our youth and our community and our people feel like they belong and feel like they can lean on us and be supported. So it can contribute to a mental health crisis when a person goes out in the world and because of the way they look or the way they behave or just in general because of their identity, they're experiencing rejection. How many right now in the Latinx community feel unsafe in public just because we're brown? Right? Because there's right now a lot of hate towards brown people. Not that there wasn't before, but a lot of fear. A lot of people feel like they have permission to say racist shit to us. So there's already this sense of rejection out there of like, you don't belong here. Even when we're born here, we're part of the community. There's this sense of you don't belong here. And then these youths or people, just adults, come home And they're being called no sabo kids. They're being called that they're not good enough. They're not Mexican enough. They're not Latino enough because they can't dance, talk, whatever, cook, handle spiciness. I mean, I've seen so many things. We try to police what level of acceptable Latina you are. And that can really mess with someone's mind, especially youth who are in that stage of development where all they want to do is feel like they belong and like they fit in. And this can continue throughout adulthood. A lot of times you see young adults who struggle with this push-pull between family of origin and chosen family, or they have trouble with boundaries because they feel like they have to be loyal to their family and do what their parents said as far as career, partner, etc. And you as an adult might struggle with self-worth. This idea of I'm not Latina enough, I'm an imposter. When I'm around white people, I feel like I don't fit in, but then I'm around brown people and I feel like I'm an imposter. So just really feeling like there isn't a space where you belong. And this can be a real big cause of stress. Again, the exhaustion of code switching all the time. This is something that lives in our nervous system. Having to be on when you're out in public or when you're in certain spaces to make sure that you don't stand out as someone who isn't supposed to be there, maybe, or things like that. And then you get to the point where you might choose to be a parent and you experience this fear of not wanting to be like your parents were to you, but you also don't want to be too passive. So you don't want to overcorrect and then completely lose culture. It's so complicated and hard. And for some of us, we get to a point where we get to negotiate what we're going to stand for, who we're going to be, and place our feet firmly in the in-between and embrace that. But some of us take long to get there. And then you grieve who you could have been if you'd come to that realization so much sooner. So like I said, it can have lots of layers. There could be different causes, different consequences, but being bicultural is definitely an important part of our identity and deserves to be acknowledged. So the now what? I know I made it sound really terrible, but like I said in the beginning, being bicultural is a gift. And before we get there, we have to kind of tend to whatever wounds we've developed from being in that hard in-between space and not knowing what to do or feeling like we don't belong. We want to get to the point where we reclaim both identities, all identities, as us in our own terms. So not feeling like we have to perform something for either culture in order to get approval or feel like we're part of them, but just integrating both as yours, whatever that means for you. Because being bicultural, some of the strengths are being culturally fluent. I can hang with my Mexican community, my Latino community, just as much as I can hang with the American side, whether that means other bicultural people or navigating professional spaces that maybe have more white people than people of color. So I feel like that is a strength for us. It has been a strength for me in my professional life. I happen to be fluent in Spanish and English, and so it's really helped me in my professional life to be able to connect with monolingual Spanish speakers and be able to communicate mental health information, therapy, and things like that. I also think it teaches you to be adaptable. You learn to adapt to different environments for better or for worse, but it's a strength because it's something we often need to do in life, is to be able to adapt. As a therapist, I feel like being bicultural has really allowed me to be more empathetic to people who feel in between, whether that's in identities, in cultures, in different spaces, but also just being able to view things from those two different perspectives, because I belong to both cultures. And so I can understand what it means to live in a more individualistic culture and a more collective culture and the strengths of both. So what does getting to that place of embracing it and accepting it look like? Well, it looks like, one, being around other people who get it. I think being around people who know what I'm talking about when I talk about being in between is really healing for me, just knowing that I'm not alone in that space and embracing each other for wherever we are. I'm good friends with Tejana, and her experience is vastly different than mine, but we get it. We understand each other and what being in between is. And even my friends who come from very similar backgrounds as me, our experiences are different, but still we get what it's like to be in the in between. And for listeners who are raising bicultural children, I think the greatest gift you can give them is naming the dynamic, telling them about being bicultural, being open to conversations around things that they may be interested in or want that you feel are not in line with what your culture is, and try to look at it, is this a cultural thing or a parenting thing? But being open to that conversation with them. I was not allowed to go to the mall with my friends because that's just not something that my parents thought was okay. I raised my kids allowing them to do things with their friends outside of school. So things like that. Stay curious about your child's experience. Even if you yourself are bicultural and you're raising kids now that are also bicultural, your experience can be very different than your children's. They have a lot of things that you might not have had growing up, a different type of technology, a different experience in school, etc. Another piece is I do a lot of this work in therapy with my clients. So I would bring this up if this is something that resonates with you, bring it up with your therapist and feel free to talk about it in your sessions, because I definitely think it's something that we don't get to reflect on. It's not named very often, and I think it would do a lot for people who struggle with a feeling of belonging. Another thing that I strive for personally is to stop policing or measuring other people's culture, because no one should have to earn their place in their culture because they already belong. And so I know that when I was younger and I started to meet other Latinas who were not like me, I would remember thinking like, whoa, that's weird. What do you mean you don't know Spanish? Or what do you mean that you don't listen to this type of music? Whatever the case may be, not doing that to other people. I don't care if your Spanish is mucho, if your Spanish is completely fluent, and I don't care if you don't like spicy food. I mean, I might make a joke about it here and there. I don't think that someone is not allowed to call themselves a Latina if they don't eat a certain type of food, if they don't dance a certain type of way, if they don't listen to a certain type of music. So just remember that for yourself, but also for others. We shouldn't have to make people earn their place in their own culture. Regarding policing of culture, in my study, one of the things that came up for these Latinas was that they felt that their parents, because again, I interviewed Latinas about their adolescent experience and their mental health and being bicultural. So one of the things that came up in the research in the study was that they felt that their parents wanted to police how American they became. And that was a source of stress for them. So what do I mean by this? I mean that their parents were okay with them, for example, taking full advantage of the American way of valuing education and taking all the opportunities that come with being in the educational system. They expected them to learn English, get good grades. They expected them to translate and interpret whenever they were needed. They were expected to do all of these things that were beneficial for the family. But when it came to things that the parents didn't view as beneficial to the family, like hanging out with your friends outside of school, like joining programs that were outside of school, like participating in the cultures of some of your friends who were not Latino, that kind of thing, then they wanted to police, no, well, we don't do that. You don't get tattoos because that's too American, right? Or you don't get piercings on your body because that's too American. And of course, that's not for all Latinos, but it's just some of the things that I heard. And so, no, you can't go to a rock concert because why would you want to do that, right? So they wanted to decide what their kids could participate and couldn't just based on whether or not they felt it was culturally acceptable. And so that's what I mean by policing culture. Or sometimes it's like, no, you're going to play soccer, you're not going to play lacrosse, something like that. And I think a lot of us have experienced these rejections, the rejection of being othered. Like, my name is Xochitl Alamillo. Are you kidding? The comments I get from people out in public, from the person who takes my credit card and looks at my name to the person who has to make a phone call and try to pronounce my name. I mean, look Latina. I'm not saying I don't look Latina, but even when people don't see me, they just have to see my name. Already I'm feeling othered. Like, I'm getting the comments about my name and I'm feeling like some people have had some really interesting ways to respond to my name. Or another thing is like not knowing what shows some of my peers, my non-Latino peers, I didn't know what shows they were talking about because I didn't watch English language television, that type of thing of just feeling like othered. Or my food being different. I love my food and I wouldn't trade it for the world, but going out and being the person who's never tasted meatloaf, I don't know, or, just things like that make it clear and evident that you are not like the others, or maybe you're different, or you're clearly from a different culture. Not to mention the systemic things, the racism, the discrimination, the assumptions. I've showed up to appointments. I remember showing up once to an appointment for one of my kids and there was a translator there and they assumed just based on my name that I would need an interpreter. And I'm not offended by that. I'm not offended, but just the thought of someone looking at my name and making assumptions about me. The rhetoric going on politically around Latinos and the infighting between Latinos, and it's just a lot. And the rejection that you get from, in my case, from Mexicanos. I have had family tell me, but you're not really Mexican, you're American because I was born here. And the thing is, I think they're talking about nationality, but I'm talking about culture. And I think they're talking about both nationality and culture. I know that when I go to Mexico, I get clocked right away. You can tell when someone's not from there. And I don't mean just not from the town or the city, but when you're American, that feeling alone. Like, I have been to Mexico and, I tell them I'm from here and they immediately try to over-explain things or talk to me in English or provide more American things. I don't know. And that can feel like rejection. I'm using the word rejection, but it's more like just feeling like you don't belong. Another thing about being bicultural is that sometimes you're so in the in-between that you don't realize that some of the things that you do or say are either American or Latino. Because I married a man who was born and raised in Mexico and in a rural area, whereas I was born and raised here. My parents are from cities in Mexico mostly. And, the clash in that culture too. Being not only the Americanizada one, but the not from a rancho one. And that can also be something that makes you feel like you don't belong. You see it with celebrities, or you see it with people like Yaritza y su esencia. I love Yaritza. She made a mistake. She made a hurtful comment about Mexican vendors selling drinks in plastic bags or something like that. And she was canceled by a lot of people. I can't help but think that she was a victim of being bicultural and being held to certain standards because she made a comment or she did something that was hurtful to people, and it was automatically assumed that she hated Mexicans or she hated being Mexican or that she truly wasn't Mexican, etc., when it might not have been the case at all. It just wasn't in her upbringing. All this to say that you want to keep in mind that being bicultural is something to be proud of. It's something that I consider a strength, but you want to make sure that you're making that clear as you're raising your kids, as you interact with other people who are in different parts of embracing their bicultural journey. And we want to make sure that people feel like they belong, because I think we all deserve. So if this episode resonated with you, if you benefited from this episode and you know somebody who might benefit from it, I would be so grateful if you would share it and spread the word about this podcast. Send me any feedback you have. And don't forget that we are offering a retreat with my therapist friend, Claudia Muro, in Oaxaca in September 2026. And we are hoping to connect with Latinas for 5 full days in Oaxaca at a beautiful bed and breakfast. We're going to do workshops, we're going to do healing, we're going to connect, we're going to do fun excursions. It's going to be a good time. So if you're interested, please go to my website at thechicanatherapist.com. There's a retreats tab where you'll find more information on me and on Claudia Muro. I'm also on TikTok, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. I appreciate any and all support you can give me. And until next time, cuídense mucho. Thank you for listening. This podcast is intended for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing shared in this podcast constitutes therapy, clinical advice, or a therapeutic relationship. Listening to this podcast does not establish a provider-client relationship, and if you're experiencing a mental health crisis or in need of clinical support, please contact a licensed mental health professional or call or text 988 Crisis Hotline.